Hi guys, so welcome back to another week of Intro to iOS development. So this week we're going to be going over table views. So first of all, I just want to give a quick update on our course calendar. So you guys probably already know this by now, but we've been having some issues with students accidentally deleting office hour events from our calendar. And so to kind of resolve that issue, we ended up deciding to just remove all of the students' edit access to our course calendar. So now you will be unable to mark an event as read once you've booked that office hour session. Other than that, everything else basically stays the same. You can still access the course calendar. It's just that now you won't be able to see like any distinguishing colors, or basically your calendar will all be the same color. And then now, but still, if you want to book an office hours with the TA, you'll still be following the same protocol as before, which is that you still want to just click onto the event and email the TA of that office hours and let them know what it is that you have questions about, and also just to notify them that you want to book that office hours. And then the TAs will be responsible for removing office hours from the calendar once they have been booked. And there's a Piazza post that I linked here, and you can see all of the instructions there. And another thing that we want to do is give a quick shout out to some students for their project 2. We've seen some really cool and creative submissions, so we really do encourage you guys to, go above and beyond and, test out different views and different properties and like try out all of the different advanced functionalities and extra credit challenges. And so we didn't end up going through all of the projects. We haven't finished grading all the projects, so these are just some of the ones that we've seen so far that we really liked. So the first one is this app on the left done by Michael Torku. And then the second app is the one on the right done by Yoon Hao Zhu. And so these are really cool apps. Let me just kind of show you a demo of their apps. Oops. So let me see. So this is the app that Michael did, and it's really cool. Here you can enter in the grocery name, and so if you say apple, and then if you say quantity like 30 or something, and you click on add item, it actually shows the item and the quantity in two different columns, which is really cool. And then you can also say like orange, and say this is like 45, and you can add them, and you see that it's also added to this list. So yeah, like very cool. The titling is very cool as well, and the background is really fun. So great job, Michael. We really like the creativity that you added to this project. And another app that we want to show is the one done by Yoon Hao. This is a beautiful app, and the functionality is as you would expect from the project write-up. You enter your grocery item, and then you put in the quantity, and you click on add, and it just shows your item and your quantity. And you can also show, or you can also add, say, like orange, and make this like 320 or something, and click add, and it just shows in the shopping list. So very cool, but definitely a very creative design. I have never seen anything like this. So we were all very impressed by just, your attention to detail and your creativity in coming up with this design. And you have actually created a custom text field here. So this is not the text field that like comes with UI kit. She used that to kind of build like her own UI text field. So it's really cool, and definitely, way more advanced than we expected from this part, or like for your stage in the course currently. But we're all very impressed, so great job. And yeah, we look forward to more creative submissions in the future. Um, okay, so back to our lectures. So let's go over a review of lecture 3. And again, we're going to do some question and answers. So this question is, how do you push and present a view controller? So I'll give you a little bit of time to think about this. And so the answer to this should be pretty straightforward. If you forget, you can always refer to our lecture from last week. But the answer to this question is B. It's if you so as you might recall, there are two kinds of navigation that you can implement. So one being the navigation controller, push view controller, and the syntax for that is the first line of B. So self.navigation controller dot push view controller. And the second way that you can do navigation is through present view controller. So the syntax for that is in line 2 of part of B. So self.present, and then you put in the view controller. And so just as a quick reminder, the difference between the two kinds of navigation is that the UI navigation controller, push view controller, has more flexibility and it lets you push multiple view controllers onto your stack and also pop them. So say you have like 4 screens or something, you can kind of like push one onto the stack, push another one onto the stack, push another one onto the stack, and then pop one off and then push another one back or then pop 2 off. So you have a lot of flexibility in how many screens you navigate through. Whereas with present view controller, you generally can only present one view. So you end up presenting one view on top of your current view. And that view basically takes over like the entire app basically. And then until that view has been dismissed, you can't really do anything else. So you can't really like add another view control on top of that or anything. And also it presents your view controller as a modal view controller, which is has a different look. Okay, so our next question is, so why do we use delegation? And again, I'll give you a few seconds to think about this. So the answer to this question is C, to pass information between view controllers and or views. And so as you guys might remember from the last lecture, delegation is kind of a coding pattern that developers follow within Swift development when they want um, when one view controller or one view wants to delegate responsibility of implementing a certain function to another view or view controller. And so you guys have done project 2 or project 3 where you have, your different like arena controllers, right? And so you've seen that like maybe in your blue circle arena, you want to change the title of your first screen, right? That's an example of where you might use delegation because, in your second screen, you want to change the view inside your first screen. And obviously, you can't do that inside of the second screen. So the second screen has to call a function inside of a protocol that is implemented by its delegate. And that's how it can communicate to the main view controller and have that view controller update the view that the second view controller wants to change. So in this case, it passes information between like view controllers and or views. And in the case that you've seen, that information is basically like a function. Okay, so moving on to today's topic, which is UI table views. So first of all, what is a UI table view? So a UI table view is basically a table representation of data within an app. And it is represented as a scrollable list of items. And so basically, this is a UI table view is extremely common amongst most apps, and it's the main way that applications can show large amounts of structured data within their app. And so basically, it shows a table of elements, all of which are called our cells. And in order for the table view to work, it actually works with multiple classes and delegates to allow interactions between your view controller and also the table itself. So maybe that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'm sure like these examples might clarify UI table views for you. As you can see, these table views are extremely familiar because they're basically everywhere in all apps. Here you see, in your settings app, this is basically a huge table view, or the entire app is basically a table view. And same with Spotify. All of the songs inside your playlist are just represented as rows/cells inside a table view. So let's talk about the elements of a table view. Basically, every single table view is broken down into a number of components. So one being the sections of the table view, and each section is broken down further into rows. And every single row has a representation as a is a representation of a UI table view cell. And that's just the view that we use to display the information of that row. Yeah, so here you see basically like in the settings app, the sections are kind of broken down by blocks. And the idea is that sections allow us to group related rows together. So if you look at, the settings app, all of the first block kind of relate to each other, and all of the second block also relate to each other, and etc. And then you see that each section is broken down further into more rows. Yeah, and then every single row is basically a cell. So here you see screen time. That is another view in of itself, and that is a UI table view cell. So how do UI table views work? Like you can see visually here that a table view, it looks pretty simple. It is just a table, but what actually gets this table to work? So basically the way that UI table views work is you have a number of different objects collaborating with each other to make sure that all of the interaction on the screen work and does what it is intended to do, and that all of your information is displayed correctly. And so that can be broken down into 4 main components as well. So first of all, you have a table view controller, and this is the controller that manages the entire table view. So it controls what you see in the table. And then you also have your data source object, which provides the actual data for the table. So if you go back, you see you see this table, you have airplane mode, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, personal hotspot, but like the actual data that goes into making these rows are in your data source object. And then you also have a delegate object, and so this manages the user interactions with the table's contents. So again, like when you're on this app, you want to be able to do certain things, like when you touch on a row, you want to do something, or maybe you want to like delete a row, etc. So all of that is handled by a delegate object. And then obviously you also have your cells, and that is the view of the contents of the table row itself. And so that's again pretty self-explanatory. You see, the screen time, that row is a cell, and that is a view that either we define or we can use a generic one that Apple provides. So how do we actually add a table view to a view controller? Well, the answer is pretty similar to what you learned in the past. The way that you add a table view onto your screen is very similar to how you would add any view onto a screen, and that's just that you would want to instantiate this table view by saying table view, or whatever variable name you decide, is equal to UI table view, and then you instantiate it. And then you want to set the translates auto resizing mask into constraints property to be equal to false. And again, you guys know that this will basically enable us to use auto constraint and auto layout on the table view. And there is some more setup that we'll go more into later. But the last step is you want to then add this table view onto your view by doing add subview. So this should look very familiar to you. But what are the new setup that we have to do in order to set up our UI table view? Well, Most of the new setup basically boils down to four main lines. So those being one, the first line, var table data string equals the empty array. And that just sets up the data that you want to display inside of your table view. And then you have these next three lines, table view.delegate is equal to self, table view.data source is equal to self, and also table view.register cell. And so I'll go into more detail about these lines in the future slides. And I kind of want to break down each line so you understand what they're doing. So first, I'm going to explain what this table view.data source equals self means. And so as you might remember a few slides ago, I said that table views work by having different objects collaborate with each other to actually like implement functionalities of the table view. And so basically the line um, table view.data source equals self is the line that is setting up the data source object of the table view. And that basically provides the data for the table. And so basically, when you're saying table view.data source is equal to self, you're saying that we want this current view controller that we're in to now be, to now implement the UI table view data source protocol for the table view. And if you recall, we talked about last week, protocols are basically, they're basically kind of like interfaces. So they are a set of functions that we as a delegate have to implement in order to carry out the functionalities of the delegate and the protocol. And so by conforming to the UI table view data source protocol, we now have to implement the following functions. There are a number of functions that you can implement, and you can just look that up on Google, but the ones that we will focus on in this lecture and in our projects are these three. So one being the number of rows per section. So this tells the table view how many rows do I want to display for every section in our table, and also which UI table view cell to actually display at each row, and then also the number of sections in the table view, which is optional. And so all of these functions boil down to these three functions. So the first one is number of rows in section, the second one is self or row at, and the third one is number of sections. And what this looks like in code is this. So basically inside of your code, you want to extend your current view controller, and then you want to conform it to this UI table view data source. And then here you can implement the functions that you want to implement. So here I've implemented a number of rows in section. I'm saying that the number of rows should just be equal to the number of items I have inside of my table data array. And then also I have self for row at, which gives back the cell that I want to use for this row in my table view. And this is just kind of like an idea. It gives you an idea of what the code should look like. We'll go more into depth about this in our demo later. So the next line that I want to explain is this line that says table view.delegate is equal to self. And again, if we go back a few slides, that is a line that sets up, so these are the four things that, so these are four things that actually make a table view work, right? So the line table view.delegate is equal to self is the line that sets up the delegate object of the table view. And so that kind of helps us manage user interactions with the table's contents. And it's pretty similar to the slide that we just came from. So basically you're setting the table view's delegate to be equal to this current view controller that I am in. And because of that, my view controller now must conform to the UI table view delegate protocol. And again, this just means that, the UI table view delegate protocol has a list of functions that it expects me as the delegate to implement in order to carry out the functionalities of this delegate. And again, there are a number of functions inside of this protocol which you can look up online. But the ones that we will focus on are the first one, the height of each row, which is optional, but it should be implemented because if you don't set the height of a row, it can mess up the layout of your cell. So maybe your row is actually supposed to be like 120 pixels. If you don't set it, maybe like your if you don't set it maybe like Xcode just makes it like height 0, in which case you can't see anything, you know? So we usually want to set the height. And another thing that we might want to implement is maybe like what happens if a cell is selected or is deselected. And again, this is optional, but these are functionalities are pretty intuitive to implement in most apps. And so the functions for those are called, the first one is hyper row at, and then for the second one, there are two functions. One did select row at, and also did deselect row at. And what this looks like is this. And again, this is just kind of a high level view. But again, you are extending your view controller to conform to this UI table view delegate protocol. And these are the functions that you want to implement. So for height, for row at, you just return 64 in this case, because it's just like a manual height. And then for a deselect row at, the deselect row at, I put dotted dots here because you can implement that as you need in your code. And something that I want to talk about is the last line of our setup. So if I go back here, I say like this is a new setup that we need for our table view, right? So here on the last line, you see it says table view.register cell class for cell reuse identifier. And so what does this actually mean, right? And so basically, this is when we register cells, we are telling our table view which cell we want to display for each row, basically. And so UIKit does provide default cells for you to use for table views, and these are just very simple, like very boring, just one row with like one label, basically. And this is a generic table view cell. It kind of looks like the settings app that we just looked at earlier. However, obviously in your app, we don't always want to rely on the default view, on the default cell view. Sometimes you might want to have your own custom cell, right? Like for example, like here I have two screenshots of two apps that AppDev creates. So on the right, we have our app Uplift, which is our gym app, and then also on the right, we have our transit app. So these two are actually cells, but these are like definitely more complex, and these have to be implemented like ourselves. Swift doesn't provide that for us. So if we want to use custom cells for our table views, we would have to write this custom cell, and then we would have to register that cell for our table view, so that table view knows which cell to use. And then I just want to also make a note about reusing cells and this notion of dequeuing cells. And so basically, you know, when you are loading data on your app, if you have an app like Spotify, for example, your playlist might have thousands and thousands of songs, right? But if you want to load all of that data within your app, it means you would have to generate like thousands and thousands of cells right on the loading of the app. And so obviously this will slow down the app, and also it takes up a lot of memory, right? And so we don't want to do that, right? And if you look at the app again, you know, like when you're on this app, you don't need all 2,000 cells to be rendered, right? Because like you only care about the cells that are actually on the screen, because these are the cells that you're looking at. And so dequeuing basically allows us to create only the cells that are used and seen on the screen. So here on the screen, you only see maybe like 8 or 9 cells, right? And basically as you scroll up, the cells that disappear from the top of the screen are then reused as the cells on the bottom of the screen that are now being shown. And so in that way, you only ever have to render maybe like 10 cells overall instead of the whole 2,000. And so this is why earlier when we register our custom cell with our table view, we also include a cell reuse identifier. This is basically the string that will identify to the Swift and your compiler, like which cell you actually want to use. Because then later you can say let cell is equal to table view.dequeue reusable cell, and then you can also include the identifier. So if before your identifier was like, you know, song cell, for example, then here you will just say dequeue reusable cell with identifier song cell. And this will help you identify which type of cell you want to use. And so this might seem a little bit confusing to you now. Hopefully it'll make more sense when we go through the demo later. Yeah, so I just want to end this lecture portion of of this lecture by going over a summary of our setup steps for a UI table view. So basically, first you want to initialize and lay out your UI table view. You want to initialize it, and then you want to set the constraints on the table view to be wherever you want it on your app. And then you want to create your custom UI table view cell, and that's the cell that you want to show on each row. And then you want to register that table view cell class to your UI table view using the syntax we just talked about. And then you want to conform your UI view controller to the two protocols that we talked about, so UI table view data source and also UI table view delegate. And then you also want to say like table view dot delegate is equal to self, table view dot data source is equal to self, and that just lets your table view know which controller it will be listening to for events that pertain to the table view. And then finally, so here finally you want to set the data source and delegate of the table view. And again, we'll go through a demo later, so that'll make more sense. And this is the app that we're going to okay guys, so now we're going to go into the demo portion of this lecture today. Yeah, so just as a reminder, the demo app that we're trying to build today looks something like this. And the goal is to get a better sense of how to use UI table views, how to set up and create a UI table view in your app. And so the app is pretty simple. It's going to be a cafeteria app that lists the cafeterias that we have and also its rating. And then we will also have the ability to like and unlike each like cafeteria in the entire cafeteria table. So I do have a starter code that I'm going to be working off of, and you will be able to access the starter code in the comments of this YouTube video. It'll also be on Piazza, and it'll also be linked in our textbook. And so yeah, this is our starter code. So let's just run this right now and see what we have. Okay, so that took a little bit of time for my simulator to load, but basically, as you can see, based off of the starter code, what we have is basically a very simple screen that just has a white background and also a title for kind of like the navigation area that says cafeterias, which makes sense because that's basically all we have inside of our view did load function. So let's try and build our table view based on the demo app that I showed earlier. So first and foremost, let's just create our table view and add it to our view. So as I mentioned in the lecture portion of this video, the setup for our table view is very similar to the setup of any view that you guys have been doing up until now. And so the process is basically, we see that here, we have already kind of like declare the table view variable up here. However, it has not actually been instantiated yet. We just said that, you know, this table view variable will definitely exist, which is why we added the exclamation mark. But this is where we actually want to initialize it. So to do that, we just say table view equals to UI table view parentheses, and so this will be actually instantiating the object. And after that, you want to do what you always do, which is table view dot translates auto resizing mask into constraints, and you want to set that to be false to kind of make sure that we will be able to do auto layout or use auto layout with this table view. And then we want to add our table view into our sub view. So view.add subview table view. And so this will basically create our table view and add it onto our screen. And then instead of set of constraints, I've already included the layout that you want to add, the constraints, and it is pretty simple. So basically all we're doing is we're setting the leading anchor and equal to the views leading anchor, and the trailing anchor, top anchor, bottom anchor to be equal to the views anchor. So it will just take up the entire screen basically. So these are all of the steps to just initialize a table view. But as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of things you have to add in terms of the initialization of a table view. And so those are, one, we have to first set the data source of this table view. So to do that, we want to say table view dot data source is equal to self, right? And then we also talked about how we want to set the delegate of the table view. So we say table view dot delegate is also equals to self. So you're saying this view controller will be the delegate for our table view. And then we also mentioned before that we want to register a cell for our table view. For now, I'm going to hold off on that, and then we can add that later. But we see, you know, now our compiler is kind of complaining to us, right? Like Xcode is kind of giving us a warning. Yeah, so the reason why it is complaining is, as we discussed earlier, by declaring table of view dot data source is equal to self, we're saying that I, as in the view controller, will take on the responsibility of implementing the functions of table view data sources protocol, and also I will take on the responsibility of implementing the functions of table views delegate protocol. And we haven't actually supplied the implementations for those functions. So in order to get rid of these errors, what we have to do is we have to actually write or add the extension that was talked about in these slides. So to do that, we just want to add here extension view controller UI table view data source. And then we want to open bracket and end bracket. And so now I am basically declaring that I will be extending this protocol. And I'm getting another warning here saying that, oh, we actually don't conform to the protocol, and that's because we don't implement all the functions that are necessary in order to conform to the protocol. So if we just click fix, it'll auto-populate the functions that we have yet to implement. So those functions are number of rows in section and also cell for row at, which we did talk about in these slides. And we'll add the implementation for that very soon. And so just like how we extended the view controller to conform to the UI table view data source protocol, we want to do the same thing, but conform to the UI table view delegate. And so we just say extension view controller UI table view delegate. And so something very similar, you do open bracket and also end bracket. And then you'll get, I think in this case, we don't get a warning to complete the protocols because unlike the UI table view data source, there aren't any like required functions that you have to implement. There are definitely functions that you want to implement just for like general usability of your table view, but we can add that later. So yeah, like here, we haven't yet written the code for these functions in order to conform to our UI table view data source. So let's look at this first function, right? Number of rows in section. Like what is this function supposed to return? Well, basically, this is the function that tells the table view how many rows it should actually render. Because like the table view doesn't know like what data it has, right? So it has to be explicitly told what that value is. And in our case, we haven't actually created any data structures yet for our table view. So what is the data that we actually want to what is the data that we actually want to show in the table view? Well, if you look at the demo, you'll see that we want to show the cafeteria objects inside of our table view, right? And so here we see that we have 5 cafeterias. So basically what we want to do is we want to create an array to hold all of these 5 cafeterias, and then we want to populate our table view based off of that array. So if we go back to our demo code, in the starter code, I've already created a cafeteria object for you guys. So this is a cafeteria class. And if we go over what this code has, we see that here I just declared an enum for cafeteria rating. So it'll tell you, you know, all of the different ratings that the cafeteria can have, which in our case is just terrible, bad, moderate, good, or great. And then here we have the actual cafeteria class. And so the cafeteria has 3 fields. So one has the name, and it has a Boolean for is favorite, and then it has a rating that is this enum. And it also has an initialization function. So this is what initializes the object itself. It actually provides the values for these fields in the object. And then here, this is just a helper function that we've already written for you guys. It's very simple. Basically, when you call this function, it'll just return to you a string that tells you what the rating is, and we will use this later. But basically, once we have this class object created, what we want to do in our view controller is we want to actually create that array that holds all of the cafeterias that we want to display in our table view. And so we do that by saying, so first we have to actually create all of our cafeterias, right? So what we had earlier was we have appel, right? And then we say let appel is equals to a new object of cafeteria type where, and if you just do enter here, it auto-completes for you. So the name of this cafeteria would be appel, obviously. And then for is favorite, let's just set them all to false for now. So it is not our favorite. And then for rating, let's just say this is moderate. And let's just copy and paste this 4 more times because in our demo, we see that we have 5 cafeterias. So the second cafeteria was RPCC. So then we say let RPCC is equal to cafeteria, and the name of RPCC is also not our favorite, and we'll just say it's also a moderate rating. And then our next restaurant is Becker, or our next cafeteria is Becker. So we change the name to Becker, and then it's also not favorite, and let's say this rating is good. And then let our next cafeteria to be Cook, right? And then I'll say the name is Cook, and its favorite is false, and let's say the rating for this is great. Yeah, and then here I guess I think we missed Risley, so Risley is bad. So let's just go back here, and so let's say let Risley is equal to Risley is favorite, nope, and then say the rating is just bad. So this is just creating all of our cafeteria objects. So once we have all of this, we can actually store all of them inside of an array, which is going to hold the data that we want to show in our table. So here we just want to say, so first of all, we want to create the cafeterias array. So we say var cafeterias, and we give the type for it. So it will be an array that contains cafeteria objects. And we set that equal to an array, and we just put in all of the cafeterias that we have just created. So we say appel, RPCC, Risley, Becker, and Cook, right? Okay, so it seems like this is complaining to us because it's saying that we cannot actually use these variables out here. We can only use them after our view has actually loaded. So basically to fix this, what we want to do is let's just declare the cafeterias out here, but actually set the variables inside our view did load. So let's just copy this. And then put an exclamation mark to indicate that we will be supplying the array for cafeterias inside our view did load. So we're sure that we're going to be supplying the values. And then inside our view did load, here we can say cafeterias is equal to this array. And here we'll actually be adding like the cafeterias that we've just created. So cool. So now we have this actual cafeterias array, which will be the data source of our table view. So once we have this, we come back to our function here, right, where the number of rows and sections. So how many rows do you want in your table view, right? Well, obviously, the number of rows in the table view should reflect the number of cafeterias that you have inside of your array. And so that's why we just say return cafeterias.count. So this way, it'll just return however many cafeterias you have. And now we have this function here that says cell for row at. And so this function is basically asking you like, what is the cell that you want us to display at this row, right? And for now, we haven't actually registered any custom cell yet. So let's just put in like a dummy filler for now. So just say return UI table view cell. So we're saying just use an empty default table view cell for this row, which is fine. So let's kind of run this code now and see what we have. Okay, great. So we see that what happened was we have created the table view, right? So now we see like some sort of table looking thing in our app. Obviously there's no data yet, but that's good. And the reason why the table view showed up was obviously you created a table view and you also set the constraints to be basically filling the entire view. So that's good. But we don't have any like actual cells showing currently because here we just return like a default cell, and so it doesn't actually do anything because there's nothing inside this view, it's just an empty blank state. But what you can do is, as we kind of mentioned in the lecture, you UIKit provides like standard cells that you can use. And so if all we want to do is just show like the cafeteria name in our table view, what you can do is say, okay, so so now that we have this table view, how do we actually get our like cafeteria cells to actually show up in this table view? Well, it seems like if we look in the demo, it seems like this row in itself, this cell, is kind of a custom cell, right? Like there's no default cell that UIKit provides you that has like a heart and that has like, you know, these two labels in a cell, right? So in order to actually get this to show on our simulator, we have to actually create this cell. And so let's kind of go ahead and walk through how we can actually create our own custom table view cell. So in order to do that, what we want to do is here in L4 Starter, or I guess in this panel, do right click and then you click on New File. So when you click on a new file, you can click on the Swift file, or I guess you want to click on the Cocoa Touch class. And inside of subclass of, you want to click or look for UI table of views cell. So then this will basically create a class that is a subclass of UI table view cell. So you're kind of extending the generic table view cell class to make your own custom subclass. And so we're just going to call this cafeteria table view cell. So then we click next, then we click create. And this will just create the starter code for a custom cell class. And so let's kind of take a look at this demo again, right? So what are the things that we actually want to show in this cell? Well, it seems like we have these two labels, right? So we should probably use UI labels to render the text here. And then we also see that here we have a heart, right? So it seems like an image view is probably the best way to go for this. So we want to, inside of our cafeteria table view cell class, we want to create the variables for those views. So let's just first declare them and say name label is of type UI label. And then say var rating label is of type UI label. And then we have the image view. So let's just say var heart image view is of type UI image view, right? So that is fine, right? But now we actually want to initialize these views. So here, oh, okay. So here, it seems like Xcode gave you some like default code that you could add to, but in our case, we actually don't want to use this. So let's just erase that. Instead, what we want to do is we want to write override init, and you want to choose this option, init style with reuse identifier. So for this, inside of, so this basically acts similarly to how the override func view didload does inside of our view controller file. Basically, every time this cell is created, this is the function that is run. So this is also where we want to do all of our initialization and like adding of our views onto our screen. So first, as we're overriding, we just want to call super.init and to say style is style and reused identifier is reuse identifier. So basically, it's calling our super classes init function, and it's just passing whatever parameters we have into that function. And so now we want to initialize our labels, right? So we say name label is equals to UI label, and say name label dot translates auto resizing maximum strength and set that equal to false. And then we also want to add that to our view. So we do content view dot add subview at name label. And so this should look very similar to you. It should look very similar to how you would like add a view onto your view controller. But since this is not a view controller, right, you see that like here in our view controller, this view controller extends UI view controller, right? But in our case of the cafeteria table view cell, it actually extends the UI table view cell. So there is no like view dot add subview. Instead, you're adding it to this content view of like this cell. So content view is just the name that is given to this cell. Yeah. And another thing I want to do is, since this is a label, let's just set like the font of it. So let's just say name label dot font is equal to, let's just say like system font of size 14 or something. So that's great. And then next we want to do basically the same thing before our rating label. So we say rating label. So it would just look very similar. Maybe let's just change our font to be 12 because if you look at the demo, it seems like our rating is a little bit smaller than our name. So that's fine. And now we have this image, right, of a heart. So let's just add that also to our cell. So we can just say heart image. Oh, I misspelled heart. So here's heart image view. So heart image view is equals to UI image view. And when you're initializing this, you can actually directly just pass in an image. So our image will be UI image. And you might remember you have to supply the name of the image that we want to use. For this UI image view. And so actually in the starter code, in the assets, we already provided you a heart image that you can use, and it's just called heart. So let's just go here and add heart. And so it'll take that image and set it as the image of this image view. And then now we want to say content view dot add subview heart image view. And we also want to set the translates auto resizing mask into constraints. So let's say heart image view dot translates is equal to false. And then we also want to set the content mode of this heart image. So you might remember that content mode basically shows like how this image is cropped based on the dimensions of the image. So there are like multiple like settings basically. You have like scale aspect fill where it will kind of like fill up the entire box of the size that you give the image, whereas like fit just kind of like cuts off any of the excess. And so you can also read more about it just like by clicking through. So for in our case, we'll just click on scale aspect fit. And that's fine, right? So now we've kind of initialized all of these views, but how do we actually show them onto our screen, right? We're missing one crucial step, which is that we haven't set up any constraints. So as per our usual process, we want to create a helper function to basically contain all of our setup constraints. So we call this function setup constraints. And this is where we're going to be adding all of the constraints for the views that we have. And then we just want to call that at the very end of our override init. So inside of setup constraints, let's first set up the constraints for our name label. So the syntax for that is you say layout constraint dot activate. And then now you have to put in a list of, or an array of all of the constraints. So in our case, for our leading anchor, it seems like we want to make this label maybe like some number of pixels to the right of our leading anchor, right? So we'll say name label dot leading anchor dot constraint equal to content view dot leading anchor, and we want to give it some sort of constant. So in our case, let's just say that's like 8 or something. So let's just put that here as 8. We also want to set the maybe like give the height of the label. So like how much space should this take up in terms of height, right? So let's just say name label dot height anchor dot constraint equal to constant. And for now, let's just say the label height would be 16, right? And then we also want to obviously set like the top anchor, right? So, you know, we have here the leading anchor, but we also want to know how many pixels from the top do we want this label to be. So we'll say here, name label dot top anchor dot constraint equal to So we want it to be equal to the content views top anchor, and we want the constant to be some value, so let's just say 8. And so let's kind of repeat the same process for our rating labels. I'm just going to copy this and paste this here, but replace this name label with our rating label, right? So again, like it seems like this leading anchor should just be equal to whatever the leading anchor of our name label, right? So it can make our life much easier by just saying rating label dot leading anchor dot constraint is equal to name label dot leading anchor. And so this way, like even if we end up changing the leading anchor of our name label, our rating label will just kind of like slide along with it. And in terms of the rating label dot top anchor, it seems like we want to constrain it to some bottom anchor of our name label, right? So let's just set that equal to that. So we say rating label dot top anchor is equals to name label dot bottom anchor. And let's just have no constant for now. Let's just make the rating label right below our name label. And now similarly, let's just set a height anchor for our rating label. So we can set that to be just equal to the same as our name label. So let's just make that 16. So that is fine. And lastly, also here we're getting an error. You basically always have to add this if you're overriding any sort of init. I usually just wait for the warning to pop up and I just click fix and it does it for me. So the last thing that we have to set the layout for is just the heart image view. So let's add that. So we say ns layout constraint dot activate. And then we say, so what anchors do we want to set for our heart image, right? So it seems like we want this heart to be in the center of the overall content view, right? Because we want it to be right in the middle. And then what we probably want to give it some sort of size, so some sort of height and width, and then also some sort of trailing anchor. So it will be some number of pixels away from the trailing anchor of this cell. So let's add that. So let's just add the height and width first. So let's just say heart image view dot height anchor dot constraint. Constraint. And say equal to constant. Here, say equal to constant. And let's just say that would be 20 or something. And then let's do the same thing, but for our width anchor. So it would just be kind of a square, the height and the width. So we'll say width anchor will be also equal to 20. And then now we want to set the trailing anchor of our heart image view. So then we say heart image view dot trailing anchor dot constraint is equal to the content view dot trailing anchor. And then we want to add some sort of padding, and since we did 8 here, we'll just say -8 here again. Padding values are negative if you're going to the left of something, and then it'll be positive if you're going to the right of something. And now let's just finally add our center Y anchor. So heart image dot view or heart image view dot center Y anchor dot constraint and say equal to content view dot center Y anchor. So yeah, it'll just set the heart to be in the middle of our cell. So yay, well now we've kind of we've laid everything out for our table view cell, right? So that's great. We have our labels, we have our image, we set the constraints, we then call our constraints function. So now that we have this custom cell, what do we actually do with it, right? So let's come back to our view controller. So earlier, both in my demo and in my slides, I said that another crucial step probably the last step of setting up table view is you have to actually register a cell class to, for that table view under a certain reuse identifier, right? So again, to kind of jog your memory, the reason why we do that is because we want to be able to dequeue cells later on, and we want to be able to reuse the same type of cell for different types of data. So again, an example of like Spotify, for example, like there's only one cell class that is displayed for each song, right? But we don't want to load all like 10,000 songs at once when we load a playlist. We only care about like the 10 on the screen. So by dequeuing and reusing cells, it means that like every time one cell goes off of screen, that cell can be reused to display another data, like another data object basically, but the reuse identifier is what tells table view exactly which cell to actually use. So let's just then register our custom cafeteria table view cell with our table view. So to do that, the syntax is table view dot register cafeteria table view cell dot self, and say for cell reuse identifier, reuse identifier. So we've already kind of created this variable for you up top. So this variable is just equal to cafeteria cell reuse. So that's great. You've kind of, you've registered your cell. So how do we now actually like display that onto our screen, right? Because if you run this right now, it still doesn't really do anything, right? Like you'll still see what you saw before, which is just a table that fills up the entire screen, but with nothing really like displayed. And so again, the reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, like all of the interaction and handling of the table view is actually kind of handled in here inside of these protocols, right? This is what actually dictates like what data do we show, what cell do we show, and how many of them do we show. We already set the cafeteria count, so this is correct. Like it should know how many rows to return. However, in here, return UI table view cell, we're currently just returning an empty cell basically, and we don't want to do that. We actually want to use a cell that we just created, and we want to do what we said earlier about like dequeuing a cell. So the way we do that is we say let cell is equal to table view dot dequeue reusable cell with identifier, and we want to click the second option that also includes 4. So in terms of with identifier, we want to use the same identifier that we created here and that we kind of like use to register our table view cell. And so it'll just be reuse identifier. So it'll be with the identifier, reuse identifier. And then this index path is basically, it's an object that tells you like which section and also which row we're currently trying to render. And so basically what's going to happen is like as your table view is trying to render each row, for every single row, it will call this function and ask, what do I want to show at this row? And so it'll be an int. And this, so we'll say for index path. And then we want to, so this function will basically return a cell for us, right? But we actually want to force cast that as a cafeteria table view cell. And the syntax for that is we do as exclamation mark cafeteria table view cell. And the reason why we do that is we know for a fact that the cell that will be returned by this dequeue reusable cell function will always be a cafeteria table view cell. And we know that because we had already just registered that exact type under this identifier. So basically like we want this identifier to be strictly associated with this type. So once we have that, we can return our cell. So, or yeah, so once we have that, we can return our cell. So we'll say return cell. And it's because this function is expecting a UI table of view cell to be returned, so we can return this cell. So let's kind of run this again and see what happens. Okay, so we see this thing that looks kind of weird, right? Like, so we see all of the hearts. We actually don't see any like text, right? So what is the reason for that, right? So if we go back into our cafeteria table view cell, we see here we created our image view and we added it to our content view, and then we set the constraints for it. So it makes sense why this would show up, these hearts, right? But what happened to our labels, you know? Like, we also set constraints for them, we also declared them, so why aren't they being displayed? Well, what's missing, right? And maybe it's probably so obvious that, you know, if you like didn't notice it, it's probably because it's too obvious. Well, it's because we never actually set the text of the label, right? So if we never set the text, what text can we possibly display here, right? But the problem is this cell is supposed to be reused for every single cafeteria, right? So we don't want to just like hard code the text inside of this init. You know what I mean? Because like inside of view controller before, you can just say like, oh, title is equals to cafeteria, and that is fine because there's only one view controller where the title will always be cafeteria. But we want this cell to be reusable, right? So how do we make it reusable, and how do we make it only show the text that we want to show for a specific cafeteria object? Well, the way that we do it is we, by convention, always have some sort of configure function inside of a class that we write. And that basically looks like any other function. So it's called func, and we say configure. And we make it take in some sort of object or something, and then it will, based on that, well, it will take in the object, and based on that object, it will set the appropriate views. So in our case, what we want to take in is a cafeteria, right? So we say for a cafeteria, and it will be of type cafeteria, right? So then basically the idea is that like for every single row, we will get the cafeteria that is supposed to show up at that row, and then we'll pass that into this function to be displayed. And so once we have this cafeteria object, we want to now set the text of our name label and also our rating label. So we can say name label dot text is equal to cafeteria dot name, right? So that's the name of this cafeteria. And then we also want to say rating label dot text is equal to we do rating cafeteria dot get rating string. So as you guys might remember, the cafeteria object has a function get rating string that basically returns the string to you based on the enum that it has for cafeteria rating. So that's fine. So I'm just kind of concatenating that with another string, rating colon, because I want it to look like the demo, which is shown here. So it says rating colon and then the actual rating. So basically after we have this will actually be setting the text that is rendered. And so this will actually get each object to be displayed appropriately in our table. So one last step is once we have this function, we actually want to call it somewhere, right? And the place where we call that is inside of our view controller. So basically here we have DQ'd a cell, right? So we're getting back a cell of type cafeteria table view cell because that is a type that we want to show in our table view, right? So how do we actually get the data that we want to show at that row, right? So as you might imagine, basically what's happening is we want to show all of the cafeterias we have inside of cafeteria in our app, right? So basically at this row, we want to show Appel. At this row, we want to show RBCC. At this row, we want to show Grizzly. And so I already mentioned earlier that this function will basically get called for every single row, right? And that index path will kind of give you the int, that is the row that is currently looking at. And so in order to access the appropriate object based on this row, what we want to do is we say let cafeteria, so we can say let cafeteria is equal to cafeterias at index path dot row, right? So then index path dot row will basically be called in this case 5 times. The first time index path dot row will be equal to 0, right? So then you'll go into your array and take out the first element, which would be Appel. And then later, once it's at this row, it'll call that function again, and index path dot row will be equal to 1, and then it'll then take RPCC. So cafeteria will be equal to RPCC at that point. So now once we have this cafeteria, what we want to do is make use of our configure function. We want to say cell.configure for cafeteria. So what we're doing now is we're taking the appropriate cafeteria. So it might be, say, Appel, right? So then I'll take this object and it will pass it into our configure function. And then in our configure function, it'll take that cafeteria and basically set the text to be equal to the name and the rating of the cafeteria. So that's fine, right? So how about now let's try running this app and see what happens. Yay, okay, so this kind of looks more like what we kind of expect, right? Like, and it makes sense, you know, it basically went through every single row and it just passed in the appropriate object into our configure function, and so every single cell will show a different text, right? So this basically completes our functionality, but the last thing that is missing is right now all of these hearts are shown, right? And that is not the appropriate behavior because as you see up here, all of these cafeterias are in fact not my favorite, right? So why is this heart still being shown, right? And that's because inside of our cafeteria table view cell, we just we just always instantiate our heart image view, and then we always add it to our cell, right? But in fact, we don't want to do that. We actually want to set our heart image view as hidden first, right? Because, okay, so we'll say dot is hidden is equal to true. And the reason for this is we only want to unhide it if in fact our cafeteria is our favorite, right? And so initially we'll set them all to be hidden. And instead, we only want to set the heart image view to be true when a certain event happens, which is when you actually like click on the cell. And so to do that, we'll create another function here that says func toggle heart and say for is favorite bool. And then we say heart image view dot is hidden is equal to is favorite. So basically, this is a function that should be called to kind of change the value of is hidden. So if you pass in true, then is hidden will be false. If you pass in is hidden is false, then your is hidden will become true. So this is a function that should be called every single time you click on a row. So where does this actually happen, right? Like, how do we actually get it so that when you click on a cell, um, like you register that click with the cell? Well, we'll come back to our view controller, and as you might recall from the lecture, we mentioned that in UI table view delegate, there are two functions called did select row at and did deselect row at, right? So those are the functions that we actually want to implement if we want to handle any sort of interaction with our table view. And so those are not actually required, which is why they didn't make you enter that, but they're certainly very useful functions to implement. So we just want to write did select row at, and you just do enter. Autocomplete will find the right function to override. And so in terms of did select row at, well, what should happen when you like select a row, right? So say we click on this row, what is supposed to happen? Well, what we want to do is we want to get the cell at this row, right? And then we want to call our toggle heart function, right? And we also want to update the is favorite like field of this cafeteria object. So what that looks like is we say let cafeteria equals to cafeterias at indexPath.row. And so this is very similar to what you saw just in the function above this. So basically, like every time a row is clicked, it'll pass that index into this function. So if I click on this, it will pass 2 into here. And so I'm going to get the third element inside our cafeterias array and set that to be equal to cafeteria. And so now we want to get the cell that is associated with this row, right? So we say let cell is equals to table view dot cell for a row at a certain index path, right? So we'll just put in index path, and we'll again force declare this as a cafeteria table view cell, because we know that's the only type of cell that we're using. So once we have this cafeteria, that's when we can actually update the is favorite field of the object. So, you know, again, you see that like our cafeteria object does have a is favorite Boolean value. And so we just want to update this field. So we can do that by saying cafeteria dot is favorite dot toggle. And dot toggle is a function that's provided by Swift that basically, if your value was initially false, it'll set to true. If it was initially true, it'll set to false. And so once we have that, then we can call our toggle heart function that we wrote in our custom table view cell. And so we'll say for cafeteria dot is favorite. So basically, this will send in the actual favorite status of our cafeteria. So if it was favorite, it'll pass in true. And if it's true, then our toggle heart function will set the image view is hidden to be false, and then we'll show it. Yeah, so let's run this again. Okay, good. So you see that now this looks more in line with what we expect. Everything is empty initially, and then when you click on it, then it will set the heart to be displayed, and when you click on it again, it will hide it, right? And that's because initially this appel object is favorite is set to be false, but then when we click on it, it becomes true, and because it is true, we'll end up calling our cafeteria table view cell and change our is hidden to be false. So then heart will now be displayed, and then the functionality is all of the cells will exhibit that functionality. So a couple of things to note is you see that like here it's doing this annoying like gray thing, right? The reason for that is because table views come with some like default functionalities or default properties. So the default properties that like when you click on a row, it will end up highlighting the row. If you want to get rid of that, what you want to do is you want to inside of our view controller, when you're configuring the actual cell, we want to set that the cells, actually, you can actually just set that within your cell itself. So basically, like inside of this custom cell, you can say selection style is equal to none. So basically, like each cafeteria cell will now have no selection style. So it won't just take the default function. Another thing that I want to note is we didn't implement the function here, but a function that you really do want to implement is called height for row at. And it should be declared in our UI table view delegate. And so this is where you actually like set the height of the table view. I guess in this case, like not setting the height didn't make anything look weird, but usually you want to set the height just in case, because like chances are it will mess up your constraints and layout if you don't explicitly tell the table view what size to return or like what height to use. So in our case, we'll just say the height is 50. So we'll just say here, turn 50. So let's run this again. Okay, yay. So now when we click on this row, the heart shows up, but we see that there's no selection style anymore. So that's good. Okay, yeah, so I just want to end the lecture by reminding you guys, Project 3 was due yesterday, but we will be taking late submissions until Wednesday. And also I want to remind you guys that our Project 4 will be due, it'll be out today, and then it will be due next week, Sunday, at 11:59 as usual. So thank you guys.